unbox and set up a brand new sewing machine. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be unboxing and setting up a new sewing machine. So if you've ever wondered what the process looks like for setting up a new sewing machine, making sure everything is functional, understanding all the different settings on the sewing machine, I'm going to be taking you through that process in today's video. Now, if you've been a follower of my channel for a while, you know that I've been using the same sewing machine probably for the last 3 years, and that is a Janome sewing machine. Before that, I used a different model of Janome, but recently the brand FEIYUE reached out to me and wanted to send me one of their sewing machines. This is a brand that I wasn't familiar with, but I liked that they offered much more budget-friendly home sewing machines, perfect for beginner sewists or anyone who isn't wanting to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a sewing machine, but is looking for a sewing machine that has tons of amazing functions and is a good quality that's going to last them for a while and give them the ability to make a number of different sewing projects. So this is one of their sewing machines that they sent me. It is one of their multi-function sewing machines, and this one specifically is one of their heavy-duty sewing machines, which I am super excited about because my current sewing machine does not sew thick fabrics very well. So it's going to be really awesome to kind of see how this does with thicker fabrics and have this sewing machine around for projects where I need a little bit more power in my sewing. Like I mentioned before, this specific model from the brand FEIYUE is one of their more heavy-duty sewing machines, which means that it has a higher powered motor. This specific model has a servo motor, which allows it to have more power with its stitching, making it the perfect sewing machine for thicker fabric and heavy duty projects, in addition to just your average sewing projects. It also has 23 different built-in stitches, giving you a variety of stitches to choose from depending on the project that you're making, and an automatic needle threader, which I personally love to see on sewing machines because it makes the threading process so much easier. And it's also created to have a more stabilizing stitch function, so I'm excited to try that out and see how it works on different fabrics. So in today's video, I'm going to be unboxing the sewing machine, setting it up, showing you everything you need to take into consideration when setting up a new sewing machine and understanding how to use it, and taking you through the different functions that the sewing machine offers and showing you how they work. Alright, the sewing machine is now in a box, so here are all the things that typically come with a brand new sewing machine. The first and most important thing that comes with a new sewing machine, and that is honestly your holy grail, is the user manual. This is going to take you through understanding all the different functions, buttons, dials, plugs, how to troubleshoot different things, what settings you need to have your sewing machine on to sew things like buttonholes or zigzags, how to thread your sewing machine. This is going to have all the important relevant information. So before you even use your new sewing machine, make sure that you take a flip through the user manual or just like read the whole user manual, because chances are it's going to help you troubleshoot things and know how to fix problems when they arise rather than having to figure it out in the heat of the moment. All right, the other thing your sewing machine is going to come with, and honestly is 100% important to your sewing machine even working, is the foot pedal. So this is going to be plugged into your sewing machine, and this is how you power and start and stop your sewing machine with your foot on the ground, so that's super important. And then your power plug. Obviously, if you don't have a power plug, your sewing machine isn't going to have power to run, so those are two things that are going to come with your sewing machine that are super important. Next off, you might be wondering, well, where's everything else for my sewing machine? And pretty much all standard sewing machines that aren't industrial sewing machines or sergers and overlocking machines are going to have a compartment in the front of the sewing machine, and this is going to house all of the spare needles, all the bobbins that come with your sewing machine, and all of your different presser feet, in addition to usually like a seam ripper and oil for your sewing machine. So in the front, it either usually slides over or this one pops open, and inside we have a little direction for threading the sewing machine, which is super helpful. Then we have a bag of a lot of helpful little bits. but I will take you through and show you everything that's in here. And then there's also the buttonhole foot, which is really important if you want to sew buttonholes. And this specific sewing machine, I believe, is an automatic buttonhole sewing machine, which are my favorite. They make sewing buttonholes so much easier. So those are all the things that come inside your sewing machine. So let's go through what all of those actually are. So inside this bag, and I will also zoom in and give you like a closer look at all of these. This is everything that you need to actually sew. So your sewing machine is usually going to come with a needle already in your sewing machine, but obviously things happen and your needles break. So there is a pack of spare needles in here. Some sewing machines use universal needles, so even if you run out of the needles your sewing machine comes with, you can usually get a universal brand from the sewing store and use those for your sewing machine. There's also different kinds of needles for different kinds of fabric. I haven't really talked about that here on my channel, but if you're using specialty fabrics, you can specifically choose sewing needles. Then all sewing machines usually come with a seam ripper, because we know a seam ripper is both our best friend and our greatest enemy when it comes to sewing. Seam rippers are going to help us get out of those difficult situations, but also we dread using a seam ripper and hate using them in the heat of the moment, but they are invaluable and they are helpful. And then the other end of the seam ripper has like this little brush that you can use to clean your sewing machine of like different lint from thread and fabric. So then we have these two white little plastic pins, is what I would call them. These actually are going to be inserted into the top of our sewing machine, and this is what our spools of thread are going to go on. So the sewing machine didn't come with them in because they would have broken, so make sure that you locate these and put them on the top of your sewing machine, because otherwise you're not going to be able to thread it. So that is super important. Next we have this little metal tool that is kind of like an L or an elbow, and you might be wondering what that is. This is going to be used to unscrew any of the specialty screws in your sewing machine to access different areas of your sewing machine if you need to oil it, or if you need to fix something internally, or get underneath the needle plate to fix threading issues or clean out your sewing machine. So this is really helpful and you want to keep this in a safe place. Next, your sewing machine is always going to come with bobbins that fit your sewing machine. A majority of sewing machines actually will use universal bobbin sizes. This specific sewing machine came with plastic bobbins, and I would have to check the size of these to see if my typical universal bobbins would fit this sewing machine, or if you have to purchase bobbins from the actual sewing machine brand. These are plastic, and we use these to wind our bobbins on the top of our sewing machine, and they are used to thread our bobbin casing down here at the bottom so that we can actually sew. There are two empty bobbins that came with the sewing machine. There's one white bobbin already threaded into the sewing machine, and then it also came with two black bobbins and a gray bobbin. So just standard colors. If you're going to sew with those colors, they are there and threaded and ready for you. And lastly, the other three important tools or elements that came with this sewing machine are the different presser feet, and these are super important. So the sewing machine currently has a standard presser foot. This is the presser foot you can use for pretty much any kind of fabric, and then if you are sewing specific seams or more delicate types of fabric, you can actually switch out your sewing machine presser feet. So the sewing machine also came with a zipper foot. So it's a metal foot that actually doesn't have like sleds on the side. It just has a presser in the middle, allowing you to sew close to your zipper. So you can use these for standard zippers. I like to use these for my invisible zippers as well, but there are invisible zipper feet on the market, so you can purchase those in addition to your regular zipper foot. All right, then there is just a clear plastic presser foot. This is just your universal presser foot. It pretty much works the same as the regular metal presser foot on your sewing machine, but depending on the fabric you're using, the metal or the plastic might work better. And then the last presser foot is this presser foot. That's really interesting. It kind of has blue on one end and then kind of a little lip on the other. This is used for sewing on buttons. So not only can the sewing machine sew your buttonhole for you, but you can actually sew your button on using the button foot, so you don't have to sew your buttons by hand. So that is super helpful.
Now before I finish setting up the sewing machine, I want to go through some of the different knobs. So this bottom knob with the brand symbol on it is your stitch selector. Right above that, all of the numbers on the knob are your stitch length, and if you turn it all the way to the S1, you can select the additional decorative stitches that the sewing machine comes with. Now behind the needle we have the take up lever, which raises and lowers the presser foot. Above the needle, the little U-turn symbol and this gray button is going to be our reverse button. And then on the far right side of the sewing machine, this gray circle is our hand wheel. So this is what you turn towards you with your hand, which raises and lowers your needle. Now, if you play around with the different knobs and settings on your sewing machine a bit more, you are going to notice that depending on the stitch you have your sewing machine set to, your needle is going to change position. So as I turn my stitch selector, my needle is going to change positions based on the stitch that I'm selecting. For your typical straight stitch, you are always going to want your needle to be in the center position. Now moving to the top of this sewing machine, I'm going to find the dial that adjusts the stitch width on my sewing machine. Then to the left of that in the center is going to be a dial that changes the needle position, moving the needle from the center to the right or to the left. And to the left of that dial is going to be the tension selection dial. And now it's time to set up my sewing machine at my sewing area so that I can start threading this sewing machine. So the first part of setup is obviously to place your sewing machine where you're wanting to sew, plug in the power cord, and then plug in the foot pedal, which is going to then send power to your needle, making it actually sew. After everything is plugged in, I then just flip my power switch to turn on that light above my needle, and I'm ready to start threading. For every sewing machine, there's always threading directions in the sewing machine manual, but most sewing machines also have illustrations on the top of the sewing machine, which kind of shows you the direction you need to thread your machine, in addition to having every position numbered. So I just followed the numbers 1 through 5 on my sewing machine to thread my thread from the top of my sewing machine all the way down to the needle. Now this FEIYUE sewing machine has an automatic needle threader, which is what I'm showing you here, but as I was trying to thread my needle with the automatic threader, I realized that the little hook on the pin that goes through the eye of the needle was not quite hooked enough, and so it wasn't working the automatic way, so I just reverted back to the traditional way of threading my sewing machine needle, which is just simply putting the thread through the eye of the needle myself. I'm definitely going to have to try and fix that automatic needle threader because it does make the sewing and threading process so much easier, but I don't mind threading my needle the old-fashioned way. I think everyone should learn this skill because not every sewing machine has an automatic threader. Next step was threading my bobbin. This is a drop-in bobbin, so you just drop in your bobbin, make sure your thread goes behind the little kind of metal plate. You turn your hand wheel so that the top thread of your needle pulls the bottom bobbin thread up to the top. For more detailed instructions, you can look in your user manual. Now, before you actually start sewing on your new setup sewing machine, I like to kind of play around with my sewing machine and getting familiar with the different settings, stitch lengths, stitch widths, referring back to my user manual to make sure that I understand how to set all the different settings to make sure I have the correct stitches for what I'm wanting to sew. This sewing machine would be considered a manual sewing machine, meaning that you have to adjust your stitch length and stitch width depending on the different stitches that you're sewing. For example, if you're sewing A, which is a straight stitch, you have to make sure that both your stitch width and your stitch length are set to the correct numbers. Now, your stitch length really varies depending on your own preferences. I usually like to sew between a stitch length of a 2 and a 3. So I always make sure that my sewing machine is set to a 2 or a 3 for a stitch length when sewing a straight stitch. Now, when you start sewing your zigzag stitches or any other different kind of decorative stitch that your sewing machine has, you need to make sure that you adjust your stitch length and your stitch widths accordingly. So I usually like to sew a lot of different types of test stitches with different types of decorative stitches that the sewing machine comes with, and my typical straight stitch and zigzag, so that I really get a feel for the stitch width and length and settings that I want to have to achieve my desired stitch look and appeal. Now, to start off the sewing process of testing the sewing machine, I'm going to set my machine to a regular plain straight stitch on my stitch selection knob and my stitch length to about 2.5. Then I'm going to change my stitch width all the way to 0. This is the setting that this specific sewing machine has to be at in order to sew a straight stitch. I'm also going to double check my needle position, making sure that my needle is in the center position for a straight stitch, and then I'm going to make sure that my tension setting is where I want it to be, which is usually between 3 and 4 for tension. And now it's time for my first test seam. This is a regular straight stitch, so I'm going to back stitch at the beginning using the back stitch button, and then just sew a straight stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way to the end. I also decided to sew the seam on a little thicker of a fabric since this sewing machine is meant to sew heavy duty fabric, and I was so impressed with the smoothness that it sewed the seam. The seam came out really straight and nice and neat, so highly impressed with that. After my straight seam, I wanted to test out the zigzag, which is another one of the most common stitches and seams that sewists are going to use, that I definitely use in addition to my straight stitch. So I had to change some of my settings per the recommendation of the user manual. I set everything to how it was supposed to be for sewing a zigzag, and this is what the zigzag looks like. Sometimes sewing machines have some issues with sewing zigzags, but this zigzag seam came out perfectly, so was really happy to see that. And again, the sewing machine sewed it so smoothly. Just look at that perfect zigzag seam. Even the back stitch is perfect. I decided to test another zigzag seam, adjusting the stitch width so that my zigzag would be a wider stitch, and again, it was a perfect zigzag seam. I just love seeing how sewing machines sew different stitches. It's always so fun to test those out. And here's what that wider zigzag stitch looks like. Again, so crisp and perfect. After sewing my straight seam and my zigzag stitch, I decided to just play around with additional decorative stitches that this FEIYUE sewing machine has. So as you can see, I'm just selecting different stitch styles on the stitch selector knob and testing out how they sew and how they look. And literally every single one was so fun to sew. Some of these are new and different stitches that I don't have on my other sewing machines, and all of them sewed very crisp and clean and smoothly on this sewing machine, in addition to being sewn on thicker fabric, so was very impressed by that.
Then once you've gotten comfortable playing around on your sewing machine, sewing up a number of different test stitches, making sure that you understand the correct settings, the correct needle placements for the different stitches, and then you can actually start sewing your projects. Now, as you go through sewing all of your various different kinds of projects with the different stitches that are required for those projects, you are always going to want to make sure that your sewing machine is set to the correct settings to achieve your desired stitch. Now, one awesome thing about this sewing machine, because it is a more heavy-duty sewing machine, not only does it have a motor that works really well for thick fabric. For example, my test swatch was more of a canvas fabric and it sewed through it so easily and smoothly. And because this sewing machine is created to sew a variety of different kinds of fabric, from thick, heavy denim to lighter fabrics, it has a really awesome knob here at the top of the sewing machine where you can actually adjust the pressure of your presser foot. Your presser foot is that metal foot that looks kind of like a sled right underneath your needle. And the great thing about adjusting the pressure of your presser foot is that depending on the thickness of your fabric, you might want less pressure, and depending on maybe the thinness or the fineness of your fabric, you might want to let up on some of that pressure. So again, before you dive into a project, I always have a good rule of thumb to kind of play around with my settings, play around with the pressure of my pressure foot to make sure that my seams are sewing how I want them to on the fabric that I'm using. Now, in addition to playing around with all of the specialty stitches on your sewing machine, you also might want to become familiar with the special functions like creating and sewing a buttonhole, which utilizes a special presser foot that came with your sewing machine. This FEIYUE sewing machine has an automatic buttonhole option, which is my favorite type of setting on any sewing machine. I love automatic buttonholes because it makes sewing a buttonhole so much easier. You just need your buttonhole foot and to follow the correct settings in your user manual to set up your sewing machine to sew a buttonhole automatically. Let's play around with sewing a buttonhole on the FEIYUE sewing machine.
Every sewing machine is different, so I referred back to my user manual to make sure that I knew the exact settings I needed to change on my sewing machine in order to sew the automatic buttonholes. These illustrations made the process super easy, and now we're ready to go. After adjusting my settings on my machine to sew an automatic buttonhole, I then set up my buttonhole foot, which first requires putting my desired button into the back of the foot and then attaching it to my presser foot leg. I just removed my original presser foot and now I am attaching my buttonhole foot. In order to sew the automatic buttonhole in the sewing machine, I have to pull down and push back my buttonhole lever. This then tells the sewing machine that it needs to sew an automatic buttonhole, so it first sews across the front to the back and then back to the front along the right side, locking the seams into place. And this is what the buttonhole looks like. Next up, I just need to open the buttonhole after I've trimmed off any excess thread. I use my seam ripper to open up a part of the buttonhole and then a smaller pair of scissors to snip open the rest. And now it is fully functional. That was easy.
Becoming an expert at using your sewing machine just requires practice, time, and patience, and sometimes problem solving, but you always want to make sure that you are 100% comfortable and familiar with your sewing machine so that you understand what's going on and how to sew all the different stitches that a project might require. And there you have it. I have set up my new sewing machine and it is all ready for all of the sewing projects that await. And if you watched this video, this is also how you can set up your new sewing machine, becoming familiar with all of the different settings, stitches, and requirements in your sewing machine's user manual. And if you want to learn more about the brand FEIYUE, you can find more details about their brand in the description of this video and browse their assortment of different home sewing machines. FEIYUE believes that every stitch tells a story with their sewing machines, and I kind of agree with that, considering I love to make my own clothes and tell stories through them. And I'm excited to create a variety of different sewing projects using the FEIYUE sewing machine, especially considering it's a more heavy-duty sewing machine and has a motor that can keep up with thick fabrics like denim. I have a couple of different projects on my list that use thicker fabrics, so I'm excited to use the FEIYUE sewing machine to make those projects even easier to make. So make sure that you're subscribed to my channel so that you can watch those videos when they come out and see the FEIYUE sewing machine in action sewing through denim or a variety of different fabrics for different projects I have coming up. Drop a comment below and tell me something new that you learned through watching this video, or what brand of sewing machine you have, or maybe you're in the market for a brand new sewing machine, so let's chat about that below. As always, thank you so much for watching my videos. I hope that you learned something new through this video, got a little bit more familiar with how to set up a new sewing machine and understand all the different things that come with it, in addition to becoming familiar with the different settings that a sewing machine might have. Make sure you check out FEIYUE sewing machines and see if they have something that might fit your sewing needs. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Happy sewing.